Richard Blackstone had built a life where nothing surprised him. Not markets, not mergers. Not men who smiled into cameras while sharpening knives behind closed doors. At 52, the billionaire founder of Blackstone Industries had learned to treat every system like a math problem and every human being like a variable. In his world, you didn't trust. You verified, especially when it came to the only two things he loved, without calculation, his sons. That Tuesday morning proof arrived in a way that made his knees go soft. He was in his office on the third floor of the Manhattan townhouse, a glass-walled room that smelled faintly of old leather and expensive bourbon. A half-poured tumbler of Japanese whiskey sat on the desk beside a tablet, showing live feeds from his home security system. He'd been scrolling absent-mindedly through the hallway cameras, routine paranoia disguised as responsible fatherhood, when he tapped into the nursery feed and almost dropped the glass. On the screen were Daniel and David, his 3-year-old twins. Two tiny boys with matching curls and matching wheelchairs, their bodies shaped by severe cerebral palsy, their muscles stubbornly clenched in patterns. Even the best neurologists in New York had called irreversible. Their days had become a schedule of machines, medications, and quiet heartbreak. Richard knew every spasm, every involuntary jerk, every breath that sounded a second too tight. But this wasn't that Daniel was sitting upright on a thick foam mat, his torso supported only by a pillow behind him. Both his hands were wrapped around a red, plastic, toy-tight, deliberate steady. He wasn't flailing, he wasn't trembling, he was holding. David beside him was on his back with a rolled towel under his knees. His head turned toward a voice in the room, the way sunflower heads lean toward light. His eyes were tracking, focused, present. And in the middle of them, kneeling barefoot on the carpet, was Kesha Washington. 28 black, soft-spoken, hired 2 weeks earlier. From an agency Richard had nearly laughed off the phone. A caregiver, they had called her, a word he'd learned to hear the way he heard temporary or replaceable. The agency had described her as warm and excellent with special needs children. Richard had translated that to not elite, not Ivy, not what he paid a fortune for. 11 caregivers had cycled through his home in 3 years. Each one came with glowing resumes and crisp professionalism. Each one left with a check and a stain on his patience, some from negligence, some from arrogance, and one from an opioid theft he'd only caught after installing cameras in every corner of the mansion. Trust was what naive people could afford. Richard had children who couldn't scream if something went wrong. That's why the cameras were there, and now the cameras were showing him a miracle he didn't have a category for. Kesha was singing quietly, not to entertain, but to cue. A low humming melody threaded through words he couldn't catch on the audio. Her hands moved over David's legs in slow, rhythmic patterns. Press, release, rotate, pause, like she was teaching his body a new language, one syllable at a time. She didn't rush, she didn't perform. She listened with her fingertips. "Good job, baby," she murmured, and David lifted his right leg an inch, then another, as if answering. Because if this was real, then 3 years of certainty had been wrong. And if he'd been wrong about his sons, what else had he been wrong about? 2 weeks earlier, he'd almost fired the agency coordinator over the phone. "You're offering me a girl from the Bronx," he'd snapped, pacing in his study with a stack of medical invoices on his desk. "I pay $200,000 a year for the best professionals. I'm not running a charity or a social experiment." The coordinator had kept her voice calm because people always do when they're talking to a man who signs 7-figure checks. "Mr. Blackstone, Miss Washington, is one of the most requested specialists in our network. If you give her a chance," he'd laugh then. A short, cold sound. "I'm giving her 2 weeks. If I don't see results, she's gone." Now on screen, his boys were giving him results that made him feel like a stranger in his own house. He watched Kesha shift smoothly, sliding a foam wedge behind Daniel so he could lean on it without collapsing. She guided his fingers around a toy with patient precision, tapping the muscles at his wrist, whispering encouragement. Daniel's mouth curved into a small, unmistakable smile. Not a reflex, a decision. Richard felt his throat tighten. He slammed the tablet flat on the desk and forced himself to breathe. This could be a fluke, he told himself. A trick of perspective. Something he was seeing because he wanted to see it. He stood up so fast his chair rolled back into the wall. Board meeting at 10. Numbers. Investors. A world where rules held steady and outcomes were measurable. He could handle that. But right now his own home had become a question mark. He left the office, walked down 3 flights, and paused outside the nursery door. He listened for a moment. The soft song, the quiet squeak of foam toys, the exhale of tiny bodies relaxing. Then he pushed the door open. Kesha looked up but didn't jump. No nervous sir, no scrambling to prove she was working. She just nodded like she expected him. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone," she said, and went right back to moving David's legs. Richard cleared his throat. "Oh, what are you doing?" Her tone wasn't defiant, it was factual. So casual it felt insulting. "And who taught you that?" he asked. He meant it like a trap, like a test she'd fail. She didn't look at him fully this time. "Dr. Robert Chen's lab at NYU," she said. "He's been publishing on pediatric neuroplasticity and alternative pathways for CP for years. I trained there during my residency." The air shifted. Richard knew that name. He'd tried to book an appointment with Chen when the twins were 2. The wait list had been 2 years long. Chen was the specialist other specialists quoted to sound smart. Richard blinked. "You trained with Chen?" Kesha finally met his gaze, not hostile, not scared, just steady. "Yes, sir, and at Harlem Children's Hospital before that." He felt a spark of anger at her, at the agency, at himself. "If you're so qualified, why are you working as a nanny?" The question came out sharper than he intended. He wanted to see her flinch. Wanting that made him uncomfortable. Instead, Kesha smiled faintly. Not warm, not bitter. More like someone who's heard a predictable line too many times. "Because I like working in homes," she answered calmly. "Hospitals are crowded, and kids there don't get enough one-on-one time. And because sometimes the families who need help most never make it inside Dr. Chen's office." Her eyes flicked to Daniel, who was trying to lift the toy again. "Your boys can do more than they've been told they can do. I'm here to help them find it." The rebuke wasn't in her voice. It was in the simple fact that she kept working even while he questioned her right to. Richard felt heat rise behind his face. He turned and left the room without another word, furious at the way he'd been made to feel small in his own house. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone and called the agency. "I want her full file," he said. "Every credential, every reference." Now, that afternoon, he called Dr. Harrison Mitchell, the pediatric neurologist who delivered the diagnosis 3 years ago. "Mitchell, I need you here today," Richard said without greeting. "The boys are showing changes." A soft sigh on the other end. "Richard, we've been over this. Severe CP doesn't change into mild in 2 weeks. What you're seeing is involuntary reflex activity. It's common for parents to misinterpret movement when they're under stress." The word parents came out like a gentle insult. "But they're holding object," Richard snapped. "They're tracking sound. False hope is crueler than the truth," Mitchell replied. "Please don't let a caregiver with enthusiasm make you question medical reality." The way he said caregiver, like a lower caste made something twist in Richard's stomach. He hung up and told himself the twist was irritation, not recognition. Downstairs, Kesha never stopped. She'd arrived each day with a plastic folder and a cloth bag full of simple tools foam wedges, textured balls, soft wraps, brightly colored toys, cheap-looking items that somehow did more than the machines worth tens of thousands. Inside that folder were printed studies she'd highlighted in yellow marker. She didn't carry pedigree in mahogany frames. She carried it in paper bent at the corners from use. Harlem Children's Hospital had taught her how to work miracles with limited resources. She'd treated kids whose parents took 3 buses to sit in waiting rooms. She'd seen the gap between what children could become and what rich doctors assumed they would be. Here she was surrounded by endless resources, yet trapped under a man who couldn't see past the label he'd put on her. She knew that kind of house. She knew that kind of man. So, 3 weeks ago, before she ever stepped into Blackstone territory, she called her mentor, Dr. Patricia Williams. "I'm starting a home case," Kesha had said. 2 boys, severe CP diagnosis. "But I think there's room. Document everything," Williams had told her. "Videos, notes, timestamps. If you're right, it needs to be recorded." Kesha had nodded. I will. She never filmed to expose Richard. She filmed to protect the boys. Progress without proof gets called luck. Proof turns progress into policy. Mitchell came with equipment that looked like it belonged at a space launch. He did his tests in silence while Richard hovered, jaw clenched, waiting to hear he was right to doubt her. But Mitchell frowned. Retested. Adjusted a sensor. Tried again. Interesting, he muttered. His tone is different. Richard moved closer. Different how Mitchell removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and stared at the boys like they'd rearranged physics. Richard, he said slowly, there are changes here. Motor coordination is improving. Neural response is stronger than the last evaluation. I can't explain it entirely. A flicker of triumph crossed Kesha's face, but she kept her body still. Richard felt a surge of contradictory relief and anger slam into his chest. You're telling me her methods are working, he said, the word her sharp in his mouth. I'm saying, Mitchell corrected carefully, that early intervention can yield better outcomes than we predicted. I may have underestimated their capacity for adaptation. Richard turned toward Kesha as if she'd personally rewritten his past. You made him say that. Kesha didn't blink. Your sons made him say that, Mr. Blackstone. I'm just helping them do what they can. Mitchell packed his equipment and left with a bruised ego and a new uncertainty he couldn't charge by the hour. Richard stayed behind, furious. You embarrassed me, he hissed. Kesha stood up, wiped her hands on a towel, and faced him. I did my job. Your job is to follow instruction, he snapped, not invent science. My job, she said, voice steady, is to care for your children to the best of my training. If that means going beyond outdated assumptions, then that's what I'll do. He chose anger. Your contract is being reviewed, he said coldly. Maybe I need someone more suitable. Kesha picked up her folder, calm as a surgeon. Before you decide that, you should know I've been documenting their progress. I shared it with specialists who understand neuroplasticity and CP far better than the people who diagnosed them at 6 months old. His chest tightened. You went around me? I went around fear, she corrected gently, because fear stops care. She took a breath. If you fire me now, you'll need to explain to these experts why you interrupted a treatment that is working. Then she knelt to Daniel's level, kissed his forehead, and smiled in a way that made his little hands squeeze the toy again. Richard looked at his sons like he'd never really seen them. They weren't statistics. They weren't a sentence. They were trying, and trying meant possibility. The next morning he opened Kesha's file expecting dirt. What he found was brilliance. Richard sat back stunned. His pride tried to fight again. Why didn't she tell me, he thought. She must be hiding something. But the more honest truth crept in behind the doubt. She didn't tell him because he never asked her like a person. He asked her like an employee. Friday came, and Richard called a formal meeting like he was holding court. Kesha sat opposite him with her folder. Margaret Walsh, his assistant, stood near the window. 2 agency reps and Mitchell waited stiffly. Richard clasped his hands. After consideration, we're concerned your unorthodox methods may be risky. Kesha said nothing. We hired you to follow protocol, not experiment. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat. We need to be cautious about interpretation. Exactly. So, Miss Washington, Kesha set her tablet on the desk and turned it on. Before we finish, she said, I'd like you to hear from 3 people who reviewed the case. The screen lit up with Dr. Chen. Richard went pale. Kesha tapped again. Dr. Williams appeared. The original diagnosis was premature and incomplete, Williams said firmly. With continued therapy, Daniel and David may reach milestones far beyond what was predicted. A third call opened Dr. Thompson from the National Institute. We want this documented, he said. Your caregiver is leading one of the most promising interventions we've seen this year. There was a beat where no one breathed. Richard felt the floor tilt. He glanced at Mitchell, who looked like someone had unplugged him. Kesha turned off the tablet and placed it back in her bag. I'm not here to win an argument, she said quietly. I'm here to win time for your sons. Richard swallowed hard. What do you want? For you to stop seeing me as a risk and start seeing your children as capable, she replied, and for this home to become a place where hope isn't treated like a threat. The simplicity of that cracked something in him. He tried to speak, tried to find an angle, money, authority, control, but none of it fit anymore. Because Daniel was lifting his toy again in the corner of the room. because David was turning his head toward Kesha's voice like it was home. Richard stood up slowly, as if rising out of deep water. "I was wrong," he said, voice raw. It wasn't a grand apology. It was smaller and harder than that. The kind of truth a man says when he doesn't have any armor left. Kesha nodded, not triumphant, just relieved. "Then let's keep going," she said. 6 months later, the garden behind the Blackstone mansion looked different. There were ramps installed where steps used to be, soft grass paths, therapy stations that looked like play areas because Kesha believed play was the language children learned best in. Daniel and David were there in the afternoon sun, not stuck in wheelchairs, but using small adaptive walkers, laughing, wobbling, moving forward while Kesha counted a rhythm beside them, like a drumbeat for their brains. Richard watched from the patio, hands in his pockets, trying not to cry every time they took a new step. His mansion had become a Center One wing, converted into a pediatric neuroplasticity clinic, led by Dr. Kesha Washington, now recognized nationally. 23 families were enrolled, many from neighborhoods that never saw a door open at NYU. Reporters came, researchers came, parents came with fear in their throats and hope in their pockets. Whenever they asked Richard why he funded it all, he gave the same answer: "Because I almost let my prejudice steal my son's future." And when Daniel and David were old enough to understand, he would tell them the other truth, that the woman who helped you walk didn't just change your bodies, she changed me. Kesha never asked for a statue or a headline. She asked for treatment to continue, for data to be shared, for other children to benefit from what these two boys had shown was possible. And Richard, once the man who watched the world through cameras, because he believed trust was for fools, learned something he never expected to learn from a girl from the Bronx in a plastic folder. Miracles don't always arrive wearing pedigree. Sometimes they arrive singing softly on a nursery floor, in hands that know science and in a heart that refuses to accept the word never. If you want, tell me the tone you're aiming for. More dramatic, more tender, more thriller-ish, and I can do another pass in that exact voice.